Okay, our next speaker is Dr. David Ellerman. He is an economist, a mathematician, and a philosopher. He is a retired scholar from UC Riverside. He's going to be challenging us with a question today: how do we make developmental aid more effective? Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ellerman.
Thank you. Okay, I'm here to talk about development assistance, development aid, relevant to the underdeveloped countries, the third world, and basically why it's so difficult. And I got into this, I was sort of a normal academic until 1990, and this great social experiment was taking place of the transition of the socialist countries to some sort of a market economy and political democracy. And so I left academia and moved to East Europe, set up a consulting firm, and tried to see if I could get involved. And I was much frustrated by the World Bank and Jeff Sachs, and couldn't do any business. I mean, basically, it came to a standstill. So I had the opportunity then to join the World Bank, and as it were, to fight it from the inside 2 years later. So I did that, and so I spent 10 years in the World Bank, and that's when I learned about the whole development business and what works and what doesn't work, and why basically the World Bank doesn't work very well. So I wrote a book, as Tom mentioned, Helping People Help Themselves, trying to explain all this. Now, am I going to get this right? There we go. So the stylized facts is official development assistance really started after World War II, where you had the sort of the communist model for rapid industrialization and modernization, and then you had the Western model for rapid industrialization and modernization. And before that, there hadn't been any really organized effort, and so all these countries were being decolonized, and they wanted to develop rapidly, and you had this big rivalry between the two blocs. The World Bank, even though it's called the World Bank, had no communist members. It was simply the Western countries, and the history in the 60 years in which we've had this experience is basically one of failure. In other words, where there was success, it was success for other reasons. In East Asia is where we have by far the biggest success stories: Korea, Taiwan, and now China, and Japan before that. And but the big development institutions, the World Bank, the USAID from this country, and the other bilateral agencies, basically didn't have much to do with it. And I can tell you some war stories about that. But on the other end of the spectrum, Africa is where the footprint has been the biggest of the development assistance organizations, and they have done the worst. So why this set of stylized facts? I mean, why is help so difficult, genuine help so difficult? And I'm going to, since the time is short, sort of cut to the chase here, and try to tell you what the fundamental problem is. Everybody likes this slogan, this cliche, helping people help themselves. But in fact, hidden in there is a conundrum. And to see the conundrum, you can actually go to, say, Ken Robinson's talk at the other TED conference. He's given a couple talks, and talks about genuine education. And he uses this contrast of metaphors, that so much of the educational system is based on sort of an industrial metaphor where you can do things to people and you educate them. And whereas he prefers an agricultural metaphor where you can set the conditions, but if the seed doesn't want to grow, then it doesn't grow. And so you cannot force it. You cannot use an industrial model. And I was just noticing yesterday the tomato on the Heinz ketchup bottle has written around the tomato, grown, not made. So you have this contrast of an agricultural metaphor. But what's really going on there, in my sort of philosophical work, try to get to the bottom idea here, and it goes back to the notion of autonomy or the notion of agency that Heather mentioned, this idea that you're doing something on your own, from your own motivation, that you're not under the control of anybody else or any other institution. And so that's sort of the people helping themselves. So if you want to help people help themselves, then you're talking about an external type of assistance which helps people become more internally controlling themselves, it helps their own agency. And that's a contradiction, that's a conundrum. Because the stronger your outside influence is on the person, the less the person's really helping themselves. They're more receiving help from you. And the more they're helping themselves on their own, the less important is the outside assistance. Like the development in East Asia was basically a result of their own efforts. And so this is the conundrum. And this conundrum comes up in all the different fields. It comes up in education, it comes up in management, it comes up in all the human services, psychology, comes up in economics. And so to understand why all these fields are so subtle, why genuine education is so difficult, or why genuine assistance is so difficult, or why social work, all that, it all goes back after a lot of analysis to this conundrum that you from the outside are trying to work with the person or people to get them to become more independent and more autonomous of your help and to do things on their own. And that's the problem, is the bigger influence you have, the less they're likely to do it. And so in the book, I try to sort of stretch this out and show how it works in all the different fields, which I can't go into here. So just to give you one example of unhelpful help, microfinance has become a very popular thing, and every time I meet somebody, they say, oh, you work in development, you must really be excited about microfinance. And I say, well, no, actually, it's a difficult story. So let me say in the beginning that microfinance is a way in which the poorest of the poor can get assistance in a more dignified way. But that's not the program of development agencies is to foster development, this sort of thing we're seeing in China now, where the poor are helped, but not because of some direct assistance to the poor, but because the whole economy gets going and grows like crazy, and the rising tide lifts all the ships. And a way in which you could do something like microfinance that would be helping autonomy and assistance would be a savings program, micro savings program, where the people finance their projects not out of some external money coming in, but from their own savings. So that requires organization, that requires a bit of community organizing work, and that's like the seed that has to grow on its own, that you can't force that from the outside. But development agencies are in a big rush to do good. They come in and they don't have time to try to get people to start saving more, to set up credit unions or rotating credit circles and so forth. So they come in with outside money and do a microcredit program, and that's what's basically called microfinance. So it's not something that builds internal capacity. In fact, it in a sense displaces internal capacity. And even given all that, it basically is often used for what we economists call consumption smoothing, for where people have a big need for money because of a sickness or because of a wedding or a funeral or something. And so instead of getting into the grips of the village money lender, they will use a microcredit loan. So it's not related to entrepreneurship at all. And yet all the programs that you read about microfinance, it's all related to entrepreneurship, as if that's what's being fostered. And even aside from that, if it's oriented towards the poorest of the poor, these are people that have had trouble getting jobs in the informal sector, not to mention the formal sector, and then to expect them to suddenly become entrepreneurs and to start real businesses that have the capacity for growth is a wonderful fantasy, but unfortunately not the reality. So what we see is people, say, buying some spice in bulk and cutting it up into smaller packages, and then you'll see sort of 13 women lined up in a marketplace, each one selling a different spice in a package. So this is a more dignified way to get assistance and to make a living, but there's no growth potential there. These businesses are not going to grow into real businesses, and this had nothing to do, for example, with the rise of China, the sort of major modern example of successful development assistance. And there are other examples where it even crowds out. What we really need is finance for small businesses. Small businesses have the capacity to grow, not the microfinance for individuals with no capacity for growth. So what we're seeing is more and more now in development agencies where you get something like microfinance, which becomes a huge fad, and it has a certain sort of heartwarming effect because you are helping the poorest of the poor and you're helping them become more dignified and all that. Yet this is not the mandate of the development agencies. And so it's the notion of a poverty trap has become a fad, so I call this an anti-poverty trap. This is something like where an agency will get trapped into a program that actually isn't doing that much about development at all, but it makes them feel good because they're all human beings that want to do something good. And another example, which I won't go into in detail, but there's a lot of optimism now that labor migration is going to lead to development in the sending countries, that people will come into more advanced countries, will work, will get capital, will get experience, and they'll go back. And this has been the huge dream from after World War II, people from Turkey and Southern Yugoslavia, all going to Germany to work in the factories, and this was going to develop those regions, and didn't come to pass. It's just not the way it works. And the same thing here, although the sending country then gets addicted to remittances, it's like a resource curse, like discovering oil, and there's no real development there, although there is poverty reduction, obviously. There's huge poverty reduction in Mexico because of the labor migration. And so what's really happening is rather than this leading to the development of Mexico and the sending countries, it's leading to sort of a deal, what we call the devil's deal, where they will serve as bedroom communities for the type of labor to come in here and do the jobs that other people don't want to do at those wages, but will not actually lead to the development of the sending countries. They will get locked into this role as a sort of bottom-level labor supplier to the more advanced countries. And so these are examples of anti-poverty traps, things that look good in the beginning that institutions get committed to, but don't really have the real sort of development impact. Now, what's the alternative? Well, basically the whole idea of a industrial model of development assistance is where you have powerful institutions that have a lot of money and a lot of power, and they can sort of think they can make development happen. And that model is basically broken. That's what we see in the 60 years. Doesn't work. And so you need somehow a reduction in this kind of industrial mode, getting back more to the agricultural model if you want, of where the best that a development agency can do is to set the conditions, but that things have to happen on their own. Things have to happen for using the internal motivation and the internal resources of the people in the developing countries. So what can be our role? Our role can be one of more, as I have there in the last point, is to find where virtue is afoot, promote experiments where people are encouraged to try to find their own solutions to what's going on, and then see what works and see what doesn't. Where something does work, then you can supply resources to help bring it to scale, and you can supply resources to get other people in similar situations with similar problems to then go and look at what's going on and to learn from that. And this is one of the key things in the whole Chinese program. You had all these huge disasters where the development program came down from Beijing, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution and so forth, and finally they realized that's just not working. And so they became much more pragmatic, and when people were starving because they couldn't produce food, then they said, well, okay, the official ideology will still be collecting farms, we'll let people experiment, let people do something else. And this thing which we now call the family responsibility system, which is a much more like private farms and private groups with long-term leases of land, so you have something sort of like private ownership of land, got going. It wasn't officially sponsored by Beijing. It was simply experiment. People even had agreements with their neighbors to take care of the kids if they got thrown in jail for doing this very non-communist thing. And then other people learned about it. They heard about from word of mouth, and they would then, so you had this decentralized experiment, and other people going and looking at what was going on and learning from it. So it was a whole different model of development assistance than the sort of hub and spokes model where the hub figures out what the truth is and then transmits it through the spokes to the periphery. This is where you encourage experimentation in the periphery, you find where virtue is afoot, you find out what works, and then you encourage other people in the periphery with similar problems, similar resources to travel and go look at that. And that was, of course, the whole model village program in China, the model brigades and model villages where things were working well, and the Communist Party would say, okay, we will, you will go take a look at that. And only when this agricultural reform got to a certain scale did Beijing finally get over their scruples and say, we don't care whether the cat is black or white or red, as long as it catches the mice. So this was Deng Xiaoping's sort of pragmatism that came. And so then the thing spread. So that is the general message, is that the alternative to this sort of centralized industrial model of development assistance, where you have great power and supposedly great expertise at the center in Washington, D.C. with 10,000 staff members and so forth, is some much more decentralized system. At the end of my book, my reform plan for the World Bank is something which my son furnished the name, Decentralization with Extreme Prejudice. Namely, you send everybody out into the countries where they're supposedly working in, and 80% of the bank staff would immediately resign, and basically wipe out what is in Washington, because power will tend to reaccumulate if you don't do that. And so you have a series of decentralized agencies and development assistance where money is not the focus. Money has a role, money can help, but money, if it's the leading edge, then you know they're not doing it autonomously because they're doing it to get the money. Government after government, you come into all these third world governments have huge problems, and you come in with a $100 million loan, well, they're going to they're going to dance to your tune. Of course, they're not going to actually make any real changes. They're going to do what you want them to do on the surface, but they can postpone all their problems for 5 or 10 years with that kind of money. And so rather than solving the problem, you're basically just funding the not solving the problem. So money needs to take much more a background role in this whole thing, and the sort of peer-to-peer learning, south-to-south learning in these networks is much more way to go. And I just gave a few examples there of the Global Development Network, something I had something to do with getting going when I was in the bank. I originally thought of it as a network of think tanks around the world, because think tanks have a more practical organization. But it ended up being much more a network of people working on development in academic settings. But nevertheless, a very nice example where it's now spun off from the bank, independent of the bank, it's its headquarters in New Delhi, and so forth. Then Global Giving is one of these internet giving associations, and they've been very sensitive to the problems of thinking that money is really the total be-all, end-all in development, and have tried to sort of harness the means of the internet. And finally, the internet is, when I make this suggestion, everybody likes to make the comparison with the printing press introduction in the Revolution Science and the Renaissance. But there is something to that in the sense that if you're really going to sponsor this kind of south-to-south, peer-to-peer learning as an engine of development in the third world, then the internet is almost an ideal sort of mechanism to do that, where people can get connected. But they still need resources to bring to scale their experiments when they have these decentralized experiments. And you need resources in order to go from one, take people from one place to another and say, these people had a similar situation to you. This is what they did. It seemed to be working well. See what they're doing and see how, when you go back home, not that you can copy it, but how can you reinvent it in your context so the same basic idea may work in your context. And that takes resources too. And so that sort of thing should be the focus of development assistance, not this centralized power. And the internet is something that really enables that thing to go forward. Thank you.